We now know a bit about the plans our federal government has in store after King Charles read out the throne speech. So joining us from Lethbridge to discuss that speech is Kris Sims. She's the former journalist, actually, and the Alberta director with the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Here she is right here. Kris, great to have you in studio with us.
Great to be here.
Welcome, welcome. Okay, so Kris, you took in the throne speech, as did many Canadians. Let's start by touching on the fact that King Charles was invited to deliver this speech. So how significant is this, and what impacts does this have on Canadians and our relationship with the U.S.? I know this is the first time in many years that a monarch had actually read the throne speech.
Yes, exactly. It's since the 1970s as this actually happened. So putting the Taxpayers Federation aside, I'm one of the weird birds in that organization where I'm a little bit of a monarchist. So because I'm into history and I read a lot of books on that era. And so what's interesting is that, of course, King Charles III is our head of state. He is our sovereign. Right. And so this is why it's so interesting, is because in order to open a new session of Parliament, they have what's called a throne speech, or a speech from the throne. It's literally called that because the sovereign, a king or queen, is supposed to read it. So it's really interesting, I find, to have the sovereign come over here and open a new session of Parliament. Putting the blue team and red team aside, all the partisanship, communications-wise, I think it's a smart move, because then it hits the big reset button. It shows that Canada is different. It shows that we are a sovereign nation. It shows that we are still part of the British Commonwealth. This is a big part of our history, and it sets us apart, perhaps, from the United States. Mm-hmm. So some of the symbolism dates back 1,000 years in this case. So yeah, pretty important.
Is very interesting and so historical and so unique, like you said, to the United States. Okay, so a throne speech is not necessarily a budget at all. So, but by not tabling a federal budget, is there any kind of benefit to the Canadian public?
No, it's always better to have more accountability and more transparency in government. So the more information, generally speaking, the better. And so this is why we were hoping that Prime Minister Mark Carney, being a former global banker, would have a budget. You know, we would be able to wait around even to the beginning of July. That would be fine. But the finance folks, they've got all this data. They have all this information. There's a ton of experts in there. It's not like they couldn't put a budget together. Yeah. So we're going to have to wait until the fall. They've now said that it won't be just an economic update. It is actually going to be a full budget. So we think that that's a good thing. We would like it to be a little bit earlier. What's interesting for a throne speech is you kind of get the tone. You kind of get the game plan coming from a government on what they want to see, rather than the meat and potatoes. So we're going to have to wait until fall for that.
Okay, well, that should be interesting. So let's maybe get to, like you said, the meat and potatoes of the actual throne speech, the content. So the Liberals are promising to protect the sovereignty of Canada by rearming and reinvesting in the Canadian Armed Forces, right? So they're expanding the Canadian defense industry. So, you know, many would see this as a good step. But it seems that almost all of the prime ministers make promises in this area, but they seldom follow through on it. So do you think Carney will?
Great question. So a lot of our supporters at the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, they're supportive of the armed forces. We know a lot of folks who serve in the military and they do Canada proud. The issue here is twofold. One, Canada is in massive debt. So we are more than $1 trillion in debt. As a line item in the budget, we are spending more on our interest on the debt than we are on the Department of National Defense.
Wow.
Yes, so not including big procurement contracts and stuff like that, but as a line item for their operating budget, we're spending more on interest than we are on national defense. It's stunning.
That's incredible.
The other element is, of course, like I mentioned, the procurement. We run into these quagmires all the time. People who are your viewers would remember the F-35 fiasco, where we were this close. We were part of the team that was actually developing this new fighter jet, and then we bailed at the last second, all stuck on the hook for taxpayers. And so what we would ask is that they get better at procuring good equipment for our men and women in the armed forces. To give you an example, they recently purchased sleeping bags that didn't work in sub-zero temperatures. Oh. I mean, we are an Arctic nation. Like, we've got this. We should know this by now. We're not new to this. Yeah. So they've got to get better at procurement.
Right. Speaking of defense, the Prime Minister also promising to secure the border. Would this, be favorable, obviously, for President Trump? Do you think he's trying to seek favor there?
Great question. So U.S. President Trump did say initially that this was all about fentanyl going across the border, that this was about border security, and people who are leading a nation have every right to defend themselves. We would expect the same if it were happening in Canada. Our issue here is, again, the government not doing it right. So if they're actually able to do it right, beef up border security, actually stop fentanyl from going south of the border, and by the way, stop gun smugglers from bringing illegal guns up into Canada, that would be a win-win situation, because then we could actually reduce crime in Canada and stop going after law-abiding firearms owners.
Right. Oh my gosh. So there were also promises to build Canada into an energy superpower, and that energy projects would be accelerated significantly, aiming at fast-tracking approvals within 2 years. So again, this sounds great, doesn't it? However, it was very vague, with no mention of what kind of energy projects that these would be. So what are your thoughts on this, Kris?
Hesitant hopefulness. So I've read Prime Minister Mark Carney's book that he printed a couple of years ago. He did so while he was the UN Special Envoy on Climate. He has been very clear repeatedly before he won the election that he wants 80% of oil and gas to remain in the ground. He has said repeatedly that he believes that about 90% of required energy projects could come from wind and solar, that he thinks this way. So that is a huge difference from what we actually need. So here in Canada, just to give you a rough idea, since 2015, since the Liberal Party came to power in Canada, we have lost out on $670 billion worth of natural resource projects, meaning they've strangled the value of that number of natural resource projects. So we need to see some swift action. We can't just hear words from the throne speech. We need to see Bill C-69, the No More Pipelines law, repealed. Yeah. And we need to see them scrap the cap on Alberta energy. If they actually do that, now we're talking.
Yeah, because there is a lot of concern in the West that Carney never seems to really put pen to paper on that. He's very vague on all of that.
Mm-hmm. He'll say stuff, but then we actually need to see it. Energy could be a lot of things. We don't mean solar and wind. We mean oil and gas.
A direct quote from the throne speech is, "Build an industrial strategy that will make Canada more competitive on the international stage, while at the same time fighting climate change." So, Kris, generally speaking, fighting climate change means green energy projects, right? Or industrial carbon taxes, which usually don't end up making Canada very competitive.
Yeah, exactly. We can just take it directly from the steel workers. So folks might remember during the election that the steel workers in areas like Hamilton, Ontario, which is a powerhouse for steel production, they were so opposed to the industrial carbon tax, they endorsed the Conservatives, a trade union. Like, I don't remember the last time I saw a trade union endorse the Conservatives, the blue team here in Canada. That was significant.
It was.
And they did that because of the risk of the industrial carbon tax. And we here in Alberta, we've got to keep an eye on this. We need no industrial carbon tax. Here in Alberta, we do technically have a provincial one, which Premier Danielle Smith has done the right thing. She's frozen it. She needs to go a step further, though. She needs to scrap it altogether, the same way that Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe has done. Because I'll put it this way. If you increase the cost of fuel refineries to produce things like gasoline and diesel, you're going to increase the cost of gasoline and diesel. If you put an industrial carbon tax on fertilizer plants for manufacturing fertilizer, that increased costs for farmers, that increases the price of food for people. So this is an element here that really affects affordability. Also, in places especially like Ontario, why would a manufacturer stick around? Why would an industry stick around in Ontario when they could just move south to the States where there is no industrial carbon tax?
Right. Okay. Well, another throne speech promise was to crack down on firearms laws, and that won't necessarily find a lot of favor with some Albertans, right? But it's interesting that a number of police forces and unions even have publicly opposed these firearms laws because they're ineffective. So from your perspective, from the CTF perspective, is this a good use of tax dollars?
No, it would be a horrible waste of tax dollars. So going back with the origins of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, we were starting started on several different fronts. One of them was fighting the GST. The other was fighting the long gun registry. So folks who are watching who remember the 1990s, the long gun registry was supposed to cost $2 million with an M. It wound up costing about $2 billion.
With a B.
With a B, 1,000 times more, literally 1,000 times more. And so this is a huge waste of money. And also, to your point exactly with the police unions, the folks on the front lines say this won't make Canadians safer. They need to go after the illegal gun runners, the smugglers at the border. Criminals don't register their guns.
Of course.
Ranchers and hunters are some of the most law-abiding people on earth, and they own firearms. And here in Alberta, we have a very high number of gun ownership. We're second only to Saskatchewan for guns per person. So it's an important part of our culture as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. On the housing crisis front, Kris, there is a pledge to build new modular homes. And so is this plan economically sound, and will it actually bring housing prices down? What do you think?
This is a great question. So we know a lot of people are struggling for housing. I'm from British Columbia originally. It's impossible for most working people to afford a house there to purchase. We get all of that for sure. The thing that the federal government can do is what Pierre Poilievre was urging municipalities to do, is to get out of the way, to fast track their building permits, to reduce their fees, reduce their regulations, reduce their taxes so that homes can be built quickly and safely and save people thousands of dollars when they're purchasing a house. Same deal goes for things on GST for new houses. We want to see that stuff reduced and gone. So that would be the better move. We're leery about government doing things because government can't organize a two-car parade. We're worried that if the government is in charge of building modular housing, which I hear has no parking places, it's all going to be these tiny little homes. This is setting up for a disaster, and then we wind up with people having all these hopes that they're going to own a house, and turns out that the details show that they're not going to own the house, and government will screw it up. So we're very reticent to see government get in the business of trying to build houses for people.
It's also interesting how Canada's new housing minister, Gregor Robertson, went on the record saying that housing prices don't need to come down. What do you think of that?
That was one of the silliest things I've heard a minister ever say, like really ever say. And it's not surprising though, because when he was in Vancouver, he oversaw a huge increase in property prices. And British Columbia had a multifaceted problem with their real estate market. It was actually connected, going back to fentanyl. If you read some of Sam Cooper's work, if you read some investigative journalism going on in British Columbia, it was connected, unfortunately, to the drug trade. They were money laundering. Like, that was a big mess in British Columbia. So they really needed to get a handle on that. And when Gregor Robertson was there, we just saw prices go sky high. And now he's the minister in charge. So again, we're trying to stay hopeful, and we're urging people to just stay in touch with their MP and keep telling them that these issues are important.
Yeah, no. It's hard to believe that, I mean, in a way, it's not hard to believe because when you see Vancouver's got the highest housing prices in the entire country, and a man from that area is saying that.
And everything's fine. Why should I have to reduce prices? And I'm going to be the one in charge. Little reminder, unfortunately, for taxpayers, cabinet ministers are paid more than $300,000 per year, plus major bonuses, tons of benefits, and their housing in Ottawa is covered.
Another good promise from the throne speech was to get rid of those interprovincial trade barriers. You know, how important is this, and will it actually get done?
We hope so. I've been in the game for a while, though, like about 25 years. I've been hearing about interprovincial trade barriers since I started. Like throughout governments, you know, like team changes, all of it. So we'll see. Quite often we'll hear premiers say something like, we want to see interprovincial trade barriers come down, and then they get to the negotiating table and they're like, wait, what? I want to protect my wine industry, or some reason like that. Ultimately, we would like to see the trade barriers gone, because in many cases we have worse barriers between provinces than we do with the United States.
Unbelievable.
It's wild.
I can't even believe that there are trade barriers within the country.
There is.
It's unreal.
I worked for an MP once who, I think, how did this work? I'm going off memory. It was cheaper for him to order some bison steaks from the United States than it was to bring them in from Alberta. And he was in Ontario at the time. It was easier for him to do so, just to cross those borders.
Wow. Any final thoughts, Kris, on the throne speech or the direction Canada is currently headed in and maybe what needs to change?
One little extra flag that we heard in the throne speech was the language of protecting the CBC and institutions like it. I wanted to flag this for people because just before the election, on February 20th, the then Heritage Minister presented a report that said she wanted to increase funding for the CBC to up to about $2.4 billion per year, so way more than they're getting now. And she used language saying something along the lines of, we also want CBC to be in charge of deciding what is and is not misinformation online. Task them with deciding that. So that's a big step, and it could be a form of censorship. So we just wanted to flag that for folks, especially for independent journalism like this.
Interesting. Kris, thanks so much for stopping by. We really appreciated having you on the show today, especially here in person.
It means a lot. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Kris Sims is the Alberta Director with the Canadian Taxpayers Federation.